So friends, already we have covered an aspect of Wilfred Owen as a poet, and one or two significant things that Professor Payal Nagpal shared with us, it also consisted of the poet being very young. The poet is only in his early 20s when he actually is forming himself as a poet and also expressing his content, poetically. It's not an easy task, but this person must have been absolutely extraordinary in his sensitivity, that he took part in the war, he learned the right kind of lessons from it, and then he gave it a kind of strong poetic expression. So without using more words to make the points that actually Professor Payal Nagpal will more ably make, so I'll request her again to take over from here and then tell us more about Wilfred Owen, this young poet.
Yes. Thank you, Professor Prakash. So moving on in this poem, Dulce et Decorum est. So the whole idea of the dream where he says that he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. Now, guttering, choking, drowning all indicate almost like the effects of the poison gas that are there. So, if in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in and watch the white eyes writhing in his face. So, on the one hand, we look at this as a poem that is critical of war. It is also a poem that presents a very realistic depiction of what was actually happening in the trenches, the pathetic conditions of the soldiers, but at the same time, the impact of the poison gas. And for this reason, this poem is very, very important. And so he says, if in some smothering dreams, the dreams are now not a space of freedom, they kill. It's a smothering dream. You too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in. And what is the next impact? So after the guttering, choking and drowning, the white eyes are now writhing in the face. His hanging face like a devil's sick of sin. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs. So now the face is no longer a straight face, it's a hanging face. And you can hear the blood that is gargling from the lungs. So again, this is systematically built up. So we have the guttering, the choking, the drowning, the eyes that writhe in the face, and then the blood that comes gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs. Obscene as cancer, bitter as the cut of vial, incurable sores on innocent tongues. So if we look at this, the impact is as obscene as cancer, and it is bitter like the cud of vial. The word cud here is very interesting. It's like you're constantly chewing on it. And what are you chewing on? What is vile? So incurable sores on innocent tongues. My friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory. So this, the old lie, and I repeat this, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, meaning it is sweet and meet to die for one's country. So Owen is totally critical of this statement, and he calls it an old lie. He says, you would not tell with such, looking at the condition of the soldiers who are like old beggars, like hags, who are trudging through sludge with organic waste, somebody who's subjected to the poison gas. So he says the children who are ardent for some desperate glory. Who are these children? These are young soldiers who want to participate in the war, and this he calls desperate glory. He says you're not going to tell them the old lie that you should participate in the war. Why? Because it is sweet and meet to die for one's own country. So, Horace's statement here was the spirit of the age, where people like Jesse Pope were, making a call encouraging people to participate in the war. But here, Owen's poetry is a complete counter to war verses written by somebody like Jesse Pope. So, which is why he's, when he writes, he initially dedicates it to Jesse Pope and then says, a certain poetess. So, if we look at three important aspects here in Dulce et Decorum est, we see a kind of, night march, we see a gas attack, and we see the traumatic neurosis that follows the gas attack. And Wilfred Owen, in a letter to his mother, he had written, and I quote, "I have not seen any dead, I have done worse. In the dank air, I have perceived it, and in the darkness, felt." So, this line totally tells us about his state of mind, about the way in which he himself had experienced shelling, the way in which he saw people around him die, and he wondered, is this the glory that they had signed up for? So, I think these lines, and to be almost, I think at a time when the First World War was really, it had of course crossed the moment of, the high point. But still, to think about this anti-war sentiment is very, very radical. It is, like we said, an act of courage.
Actually, the First World War and the Second World War, and in India, which was a colony of the Britain, and that colony also had to send soldiers on behalf of the colonizer, and in fact the phrase that came up in India at that point of time was cannon fodder. That young people were sent to the war in order to die there, and that thing is captured so well by Wilfred Owen in the just early years of this kind of poetry. And I am only repeating, the choice of words is remarkable. In here, and then and desperate glory is something that doesn't allow us to say anything positive about the war.
Yes,
because one is desperate for glory. Glory is something to be celebrated, and here people suffer because they are seeking that kind of glory. So I think such poetry should be, as you rightly said, should be pointed out as some kind of inspiration for those who want peace, who want harmony, who want spontaneity and humanist affection, and that is being targeted by the perpetrators of one war and later on the other war.
The other war, absolutely. So this really, kind of makes us think, and it's only when we place it in that context, bringing in Jesse Pope and bringing in, the whole idea of the kind of verses, the kind of sentiment actually, not just poetry, the sentiment of the people, and how, in countering it by calling it an old lie, that don't repeat this to young children who are, ardent for glory. So, there's no point in subjecting them through this kind of traumatic, almost neurosis that he talks about. Stephen Benz, in an article which is titled "The Poet as Rhetor," says something important. He says, people on the home front continually read and heard about the strong morale and high spirits among the troops. They only saw pictures of happy, vigorous soldiers at the front doing things like singing, writing, playing with pets. So this was actually, the way in which the youth was being invited to participate in the war, all to suggest that the fight was going well and that the soldiers were doing fine. The cover of the War Illustrated for 16 June 1917, for example, depicts smiling soldiers in their trench playing musical instruments. So look at this, the smiling.
A kind of picnic scene.
Exactly. And it's anything but that.
Yes.
It's nightmarish. So I'll complete this quote. The War Illustrated, the cover of the War Illustrated of 16th June 1917 depicts smiling soldiers in their trench playing musical instruments, smoking pipes, and enjoying the company of pet cats and a dog. Laying the foundation for his case against the war, Owen presents an alternative picture of frontline conditions that directly contradicts the official view. The condition of these troops is desperate, the circumstances in the trenches dire and intolerable. Through this imagery, Owen gives a more detailed picture of what Sassoon meant by the sufferings of the troops. So, imagine that, you know, there are, you know, the magazine, The War Illustrated is showing, you know, the soldiers in a very happy state, and here is a poet who decides to take it on and write about the reality of the trenches.
And this gets connected, you know, with the kind of economic exploitation going on in the colonies. And the whole world has already become one, and people from different parts of the world are being called to participate in the war. And because they are compelled to come here, then some kind of propaganda is needed, some kind of advertisement is needed.
Exactly.
And the advertisement, already you have shown that there is a picture, and everything is belied in that picture. People are singing and dancing, but when the war is on and the poisonous gas is being used, you can't think of dancing at all. Or
in fact, you know, that's so true that if we actually expand it to the context of you know, colonization and how people from the colonies were also being asked to participate in the war. So on the one hand, there is the spirit of, you know, patriotism and towards the country, that is a draw, you know, a moment of glory, so to say. And at the same time, you know, there are mercenary aspects at work when people from colonies are being called, and these happy pictures are meant to be a draw, really speaking. And both Sassoon's statement and Owen's poetry, and we'll be taking a look at one or two more poems by Wilfred Owen to understand this. So all these really tell us, you know, how this is absolutely, you know, the wrong picture, the old lie, as he calls it. Another very important aspect is that James Campbell has actually referred to this kind of poetry as the trench lyric. And I'd like to briefly talk about what he defines as the trench lyric. So Campbell says that the trench lyric constitutes a formally conservative, realistic text based on the direct combat experience of the junior officer class. Now, it's interesting that this is the time, as I said, that writers like poets like T.S. Eliot are writing, but the poetry that Owen writes is very, very different. It is realistic, and this is unlike the war poetry is unlike in that sense the poetry that is being written around this time, because there is a kind of linguistic complexity that is weaved into poetry, which poets like Owen totally stay away from. Though of course he is using rhetoric, he is using irony, he is using a rhyme scheme, but all these are very different from, let's say, a very Eliotesque problematic. So the trench lyric is so conservative, it is a realistic text and is based on direct experience. So when we read Dulce et Decorum est, we know that the poet is speaking from a kind of first-hand experience. And so a trench, Campbell says, is, you know, the poet's most common setting for this reason, not necessarily the scene of composition, because, I mean, he had also composed this while he was recovering in the Craig Lockhart Hospital. In fact, he says, few of the trench lyricists wrote finished poetry while physically in the trenches, because obviously being in the trenches placed an immediate physical demand, which of course they had to fulfill rather than, you know, be writing poetry there. So the trench with its accompanying images of filth, shellfire, barbed wire and so on is of course the dominant icon of the First World War. The trench lyric portrays these distressing conditions in an unromantic light, differentiating it from the more abstract and patriotic lyrics of the early war. So, you know, like the whole Jesse Pope thing. So the trench lyric as a genre is realistic because it employs the traditional styles and dictions of English poetry, especially as used in the Georgian poetry movement that was gaining cultural momentum just prior to the outbreak of the war, in such a manner as to be accepted by a politically, if not politically, conservative context. So, and then Campbell goes on to explain how one aspect, which is a single most defining aspect, is that it is based on personal experience. The trench lyric emerges from the first-hand experience of the soldier and is written from the point of view of the direct observer. So this is, we talk today about life writings, confessional writing, but here is what we can call experiential writing. And so the legitimacy of the poem is that it is based on the what Campbell calls the putative accuracy of its representation by the writer's experience in the trench.
You have drawn a kind of comparison between poetry that was being written or visualized in the pre-First World War situation and the poetry that finally came up. So trench poetry, trench lyric is the after the war had begun and started
Yes.
showing its teeth.
Yes.
Okay, and before that there was a kind of
early war years were more, which is why the dedication to Jessie Pope and then cutting it out and writing to a poetess. So the reason is that the poetry was being used as in terms of making a call to the people, to the youths, to come and participate and
In the
in the war and bask in glory. Really speaking, that you're doing everything for the nation. So that idea of patriotism that is projected by the early war poetry is totally rejected.
It is so different from the 19th century patriotic poem or nationalistic poem at all.
Yes.
Because now that is the same is being used under a plan and in order to popularize the war, where war can't be popularized
Exactly.
in the 20th century.
Which is very, the whole idea of poetry kind of bringing people together in terms of a war to fight for the nation, to consolidate the nation, all these ideas are being rejected by Owen, because he says that at the ground level, and Campbell very carefully says the junior officer because he's the person who's in the trenches. So at the ground level, the experience is anything but glorious. Anything but glorious. In fact, it is totally nightmarish. I particularly like the use of the color green, because green indicates, a kind of poison. Green indicates it's symptomatic in a sense of a kind of malaise that is there. All these go on to totally question and reject the kind of poetry that is written in the early years. So
the whole thing is a sham. When the First World War begins, I am told that, and even criticism should recognize this, that the war was fought in order to capture more markets from the rest of the people.
Yes.
So there were people, both of them capitalist countries, and they were fighting against each other in order to capture more markets.
Yes.
Which is not patriotism at all.
At all.
Or nationalism for that matter.
Yes. So in fact, Owen's poetry, for instance, there is a kind of the Keatsian sensuousness that is there. He's totally presenting it in a very different way. Now, beauty is truth. Here, it is totally reversed, and it's as if the visions of horror are there because they are horrible, and this is what kind of the war really gives to the people. So, for instance, Shantanu Das in an essay talks about how mustard gas corrodes the body, and in Owen's depiction, the testimony of the gas attack moves from what he calls visual impressions to guttural processes, from sounds produced between the body and the world. So, from fumbling, stumbling, floundering, drowning, and to sounds within the body. We move to sounds within the body: guttering, choking, writhing, gargling. So, War Protest is written then through what he calls a language of wounds. It is this that propels, the imagination, and Owen's visceral imagination takes a step further, and a movement horrifically apt, he says, where a striking piece of war realism is presented. The poem also tunnels into, let's say, the whole idea of medical history here. So, if we look at another poem by, again, a very short poem by Wilfred Owen, so it's called The Anthem for Doomed Youth. And he says, like we have, the bent backs there, he says over here, what passing bells for these who die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the guns. So it's only the guns that are screeching in a sense, because the people are dying like cattle. Only the stuttering rifles rapid rattle. So look at the alliteration here, rifles rapid rattle. Only the stuttering rifles rapid rattle can patter out their hasty orisons. No mockeries now for them, no prayers nor bells, nor any voice of mourning save the choirs. The shrill demented choirs of wailing shells and bugles calling for them from sad shires.
It appears to be a painting.
Yes.
The war is being, caught in its dynamic movement, movability, and language actually serves the purpose of, creating a sense of horror along with these words.
There is horror, and the doomed youth. It's the whole idea that the first statement that they die as cattle, and who's mourning for them? There is no possibility of any mourning for them, because the all that one hears is what he calls the shrill demented choirs of wailing shells and bugles that are calling for them from sad shires. So what candles may be held to speed them all, not in the hands of boys but in their eyes, shall shine the holy glimmers of goodbyes. So it's very, very sad, and it's really hard hitting, and one sees how the youth was totally, so many young people died during the First World War, as it happens during any war. And Wilfred Owen, in a sense, takes it upon himself to, really speaking, use poetry to be critical of the war and the demand that it places on the youth of seeking glory through the war. So I think that is significant. And here's another one that says, it's titled Arms and the Boys. And so he says, let the boy try along this bayonet blade, how cold steel is and keen with hunger of blood. So, and if we look at all these, the three poems that one has really discussed here, all three of them, the depiction of the young boys is, very, very clearly made. And everything from the poison gas to the guns to cold steel, the armory in a sense, the instruments and the guns, all these things are they totally make one question what really, from a humanitarian perspective, what really is in store for these people who participate in it. So,
and the emphasis seems to be on the dying of the young, because naturally the people who are in the best of their health will go and fight like this in these conditions. If you are about 30 or about 40, then you can't fight.
yes.
So the young lot, that is being destroyed systematically through use of poisonous gases.
Yes.
This is a different kind of war.
Poisonous gases and all other, as I said, the entire armory of war in a sense. So, for instance, here it's the bayonet blade, and how the bayonet blade is cold steel, because it's not going to spare the young boys. So it's cold steel, and so he says, and thinly drawn with famishing for flesh. So the bayonet is, almost kind of, personified here with saying that, thinly drawn with famishing flesh, lend him to stroke these blind, blunt bullet leads, which long to nuzzle in the heart of lads. So
I think electricity is used very well.
Very well, yes. And the bullets are waiting to lodge themselves in the hearts of lads.
Imagine that.
So it is, it makes one feel sad about the way in which war, in a sense, and this is a poem for all times, really speaking, and of course it is written towards the end of the First World War, but it is about the entire experience, and to not fool people with the lie of patriotism and glory. So of course also reminded of Shaw's play here, but yes, in terms of poetry, I think writers like Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, they really kind of almost create a subcategory here of poetry that is critical in a sense of the war.
Professor Payal Nagpal, just think about modernist poetry being written at the same time. So, did they also react to the poems of this kind, the war poetry, or did they learn any lessons from this? T.S. Eliot, for instance. W.B. Yeats, of course, learned.
Yes.
There's no doubt about that.
Yeats, of course, did.
But Eliot, I don't think, went into the destruction and killing. He was talking about melees that may be at least distantly related. Otherwise, modernist poetry doesn't seem to have learned anything from here.
Not at all, actually, and I agree with you there. And of course, we have poems like The Hollow Men or The Wasteland, but they're all based more on the existential angst.
Yes,
And
yes.
the individual who's in a world that he or she is totally alienated from, but to hit upon this one aspect that actually in the world was changing things rapidly. I mean, soon enough one would be using the same tropes and moving into the Second World War. So
after 20 years.
exactly, and the same tropes apply. The same tropes are going to be used. In any space, in any country, the same tropes will be used to get people on board to fight for the nation. But here, Owen's poetry really makes us pause. It makes us stop. It makes us think that what is the meaning of the word heroic really in this context, and is there any point in this kind of heroism? It is only something that is going to take away the life of young people, and even if they do survive, it will leave them good for nothing, because they have already lost their powers to hear anything. They can't even hear the shelling, so what else are they going to really speaking hear? So here again, if we just look at another few lines where he says the war is going to give him cartridges of fine zinc teeth, sharp with the sharpness of grief and death. But what are the teeth meant for? For his teeth seem for laughing round an apple. There lurk no claws behind his fingers supple, and God will grow no talons at his heels, nor antlers through the thickness of his curls. So, arms and the boy here. And this tells us about the way in which different weapons are being used, and these weapons are only literally mutilating the young people.
How to sum up, with 3 or 4 sentences, the essence of this kind of poetry at the end of the lecture, that I think will.
So I think it remains in of course Campbell uses specifically the term trench lyric, but all these poems remain within the category of war poetry that belongs to, especially a lot of war poetry that emerges in the interwar years between the First and the Second World War. And I think more attention needs to be paid to these poems to understand the realism that they bring out, the reality about what really speaking goes on at the ground level, and the way in which poetry can be used to talk about these things. And one needs to keep in mind something that we've discussed very closely about how it is very, very different from the modernist poetry that's being written around the time. So one feels that adequate attention has still not been paid to war poetry, but more needs to be written and said about it, in this context.
So friends, as we end the lecture, this kind of summing up is required, in fact, that more should be read about this poetry, more should be thought about it, and right kind of lessons should be drawn, at least in the historical sense, so that things like war and things like war poetry are not produced by why human politics and social politics and all that goes into the making of wars, which are actually in today's context obscene. So you think about more about this, and there are all the time in the world war clouds are hovering over us, and in the 21st century the same thing happens. And I think a right kind of lesson would be to read these poems and to consider them seriously. So I hope you have understood the gravity of the situation regarding this war, and you can apply that to other war situations that get created in our context again and again. Thank you.